Robertson, who was governor at the time, sent the adjutant general, who is the top military officer in the National Guard in Oklahoma, to Tulsa. The adjutant general arrived and immediately sized up the situation as being exactly what the governor had been told by that deputy. And the adjutant general mobilized the Oklahoma National Guard, and they sent in guard units from as far away as Enid and Lawton, Oklahoma City and Muskogee and places like that. And a lot of people attribute the troops that arrived were federal troops. They weren't federal troops. Federal troops were never deployed here. This was the Oklahoma National Guard that came in. Many of the survivors who I interviewed when they were still alive told me, frankly, the black survivors, they told me, frankly, they wouldn't have been alive that day if it hadn't been for Oklahoma National Guardsmen. Because the Guardsmen came in and the very first thing they did was declare martial law and threatened to shoot anybody who was found armed. They set up internment compounds to protect black refugees because black refugees were scattered all over the city. Their homes were burned. They had no place to go. And so they set up internment compounds around the city in various parks and places like this.
But the next morning, the different white people was out there calling for their Negroes. They maids and butlers and things. Because my husband he stood in good with his man. He worked at a rooming house. I'd said a rooming house. That they called it then a sporting house. But that's where he worked. And the man he worked for was Ardmore Rooms on First Street where he worked. Well, that man, the owner of it, he come out there calling for T.R. Davis. And when he found T.R., then him and T.R. come over there where I was and got me, and we went on home. So, but I didn't tell you, one of my husband's best friends was killed that day while we was in that rush. See, he told him not to run and don't get in close places because they'd just shoot in that bunch. This fellow was named Willie Lockett. He and my husband were great friends, and I said to him, so where are you going, Willie? He said, I don't know, man, so I'm just going. And he was on a horse, and they said this was one of their favorite horses of the Lockett family. So T.R. told him to be careful and stay out in the open. But he was killed that day.
Every single insurance company that had a policy covering any kind of damage to homes or commercial businesses or industry cut and ran on their insurance policy because a riot wasn't included. The federal government and the state governments didn't have programs in place to compensate citizens for being the victims of a breakdown of law and order. So effectively, the citizens who lived in Little Africa took the entire loss. The problem was that when we're talking entire loss, we're talking everything. There was no FDIC then. They might have had their money in a bank, and if the bank was burned and the money stolen, there was no way to recoup it. Jewelry stores in Little Africa were stripped clean. Furniture was taken out of homes. Everything was gone. And the homes were burned to the ground. So when we're talking about refugees, we're talking about refugees that had nothing left except what they carried on their back.
Yes, was a good friend of mine. She and her husband gave birth to a little baby that night, and you know, I guess they didn't have nothing to put it in because there wasn't no conveniences. They put it in a shoebox, newborn baby. But some people, you know, some people that day, you couldn't stop them from running. We had to walk because that was our safest way. But these people was running, and seemed as though that they set this box down where this baby was, and to rest, because people got awfully tired, and they couldn't find it. It was stillborn, already dead. But they didn't want to throw it away. They wanted to take it home and then have the funeral. But they didn't get to. And there was so many things that taken place that day. That we lost our best doctor the next morning. But they told me that he stood somewhere there in one of those buildings down by where that little 3 Cardinal place is on Greenwood. You know, it's a ruined house on that side, and there's something like that on this side, and then the brickyard. Well, they said he stood along there, and he just mowed quite a few of them down.
There were witnesses that an airplane crossed the black community by air and something was thrown out of it. There were explosions. The problem is that you don't have a cause and effect direct relationship, because Tulsa was piped by natural gas in those days, as it is today. And many of the homes were already burning. So from a more precise perspective, there isn't hard proof that a plane came over the black community and dropped bombs on the black community. However, there have been a couple of things we've been able to establish. There was a plane over the black community. There were things thrown out of it. There are some interesting conclusions you can reach from some of the available evidence. First, it wasn't a government plane. There were only about a half dozen planes in the state at that time that belonged to the government. There was no Air Force then. The Air National Guard didn't exist. And there were about a half a dozen biplanes at Fort Sill. None of them took off the ground during this period. But this was the period of barnstormers. It wasn't uncommon for a pilot who learned how to fly in World War I to have a biplane and to fly around the country and do tricks at state fairs and maybe take somebody up for a couple of dollars. That, in all likelihood, was what happened then. That a barnstormer who had his own airplane actually flew over the black community. Now, if he threw out anything, and if it was a bomb, it's perfectly understandable how it could have worked, because it doesn't take very much to make a bomb, particularly if you're a veteran of a recent war that had just ended.
Greenwood was soon labeled the Black Wall Street of America. It consisted of highly educated black doctors, lawyers, PhDs, merchants, oilmen, and entrepreneurs.
The interesting thing about this particular situation is that in North Tulsa in 1921, prior to the riot, there existed an area called Little Africa. And that was a mark of respect. The black business community was extraordinarily prosperous. As a matter of fact, possibly the best minds in black America had migrated to North Tulsa in the late teens and early 20s. They built a commercial and business establishment so prosperous that it rivaled any place in the world. In fact, the main street of Little Africa, Greenwood, was euphemistically referred to as the Black Wall Street. There were millionaires that lived there, and some of the architecture of some of the old homes in North Tulsa today represent that particular period.
Ooh.